On February 16, 1943, Soviet tanks rolled into Kharkov, the fourth largest city in the Soviet Union. Morale was at an all-time high. They had just destroyed an entire German army group at Stalingrad. They were advancing on every front, and STAVKA was genuinely convinced the Wehrmacht was finished. Some Soviet commanders were already planning operations to end the war by summer. Exactly 1 month later, they would be running for their lives, and the Germans took Kharkov back. And the man who made that happen did it with fewer tanks, fewer men, and a plan that broke every rule. STAVKA thought it understood about how the Wehrmacht fought. So today we're covering the full story of what happened in those weeks between the fall of Stalingrad and the recapture of Kharkov, how the Soviets went from planning the end of the war to running for their lives, and how one German field marshal, Erich von Manstein, pulled off what many historians still consider the single greatest counterattack of the entire Second World War. To understand what Manstein did, you first have to understand the mess he was working with. By early February 1943, the German position in southern Russia was falling apart. The Sixth Army had just surrendered at Stalingrad. Around 90,000 men walked into Soviet captivity, and somewhere between 120,000 and 150,000 more had been killed. That was the largest and best-equipped field army Germany had gone. And the damage didn't stop there. The Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian armies that had been guarding the flanks of the Sixth Army were shattered. 2. There was a gap in the German lines stretching roughly 300 kilometers between Brest and Rostov, and the Soviets were pouring through it. At the start of Operation Barbarossa, the Wehrmacht had about 3,300 tanks on the Eastern Front. By late January 1943, only around 495 were still operational along the entire front, and most of those were older models. The Wehrmacht was roughly 470,000, men below full strength, and remember, Manstein had already tried to relieve the Sixth Army back in December with Operation Winter Storm. He got within about 48 kilometers of the pocket before the whole thing collapsed. He simply didn't have enough to break through. So, by the time the Sixth Army officially surrendered on February 2nd, Manstein was left trying to hold together what was now called Army Group South, with 32 divisions spread across a 700-kilometer front, and STAVKA wasn't going to give him time to figure it out. Stalin and the Soviet High Command saw what everyone else saw. The Germans were broken, and they decided this was the moment to finish them off in the south. On the same day the POW surrendered the Sixth Army, the Soviets launched 2 massive offensives. Operation Star, run by General Golikov's Voresh Front, would drive west toward Kharkov and Belgorod. Operation Gallop, under General Vatutin's southwestern front, would push even further, aiming all the way to the Dnieper River crossings and, ultimately, to the Sea of Azov. If Gallop succeeded, it would cut off every German unit east of the Dnieper. That wasn't just the destruction of Army Group South. That was potentially the end of the German position in Russia entirely, and at first everything went exactly according to plan. Golikov's forces smashed through the undermanned German Second Army. Kursk fell on February 8th. Soviet armies advanced on Kharkov from multiple directions, pushing through defenses that simply didn't have enough men to hold. On February 15th, SS General Hauser, commanding the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, looked at the situation and made a decision that would have serious consequences. Hitler had ordered Kharkov held at all costs. Hauser pulled his divisions out anyway. The next day, February 16th, Soviet forces rolled into the city. Meanwhile, further south, Vatutin's Operation Gallop was making even more alarming progress. The spearhead was Mobile Group Popov, 4 Tank Corps under Lieutenant General Marian Popov, driving southwest toward the Dnieper crossings. By mid-February, elements of the 25th Tank Corps had covered over 300 kilometers in less than 10 days. They were approaching Zaporizhia, which happened to be the location of Manstein's own headquarters and the last major road connecting the German southern wing to its supply lines. And here's where the story gets interesting, because STAVKA was reading the situation completely wrong. Soviet intelligence was reporting massive German troop movements to the west. Roads were choked with vehicles, heavy equipment was being abandoned, and forward air bases were being evacuated. Soviet commanders interpreted all of this as a German retreat toward the Dnieper. The Wehrmacht was running, and this was no time to ease up. They pushed their exhausted, undersupplied armies forward even harder. What they didn't know was that 3 elite Waffen-SS Panzer divisions had been transferred east from France, freshly refitted and close to full strength. They didn't know that Manstein was pulling the 1st Panzer Army from his right flank and repositioning it to his left. And they didn't know that the Luftwaffe's 4th Air Fleet had quietly regrouped and increased its daily sorties from about 350 in January to over 1,000 in February. What looked like a retreat was actually a repositioning. Manstein later described it using a chess term. He called it castling, the move where a king and a rook exchange places. You improve your defensive position while simultaneously freeing your most powerful attacking piece. The German armies were the rook and they were about to move. But there's another detail that makes this even more remarkable. On February 17th, Hitler flew to Manstein's headquarters at Zaporizhia to discuss the situation. He stayed for 3 days. On February 19th, Soviet tanks from the 25th Tank Corps appeared on the outskirts of the city, roughly 5 kilometers from the airfield where Hitler's plane was sitting. An armored train and scrambled aircraft managed to block the Soviet advance just long enough for Hitler to be evacuated. There was, in Manstein's own words, not a single unit between them and the enemy. The Soviets came so close to fundamentally changing the course of the war without even knowing it. Those tank crews had no idea Hitler was there. They were just following their orders and driving toward the Dnieper. But here's what Manstein understood that STAVKA didn't. The further the Soviets advanced, the weaker they got. Months of continuous offensive operations since December had ground down Soviet formations to a fraction of their authorized strength. Divisions in the 40th Army averaged between 3,500 and 4,000 men each. Some divisions in the 69th Army were down to 1,000 to 1,500 soldiers. A few had as little as 20 to 50 mortars for fire support. Vatin's southwestern front requested over 19,000 replacements and 300 tanks. They received almost nothing. The Voronezh front had gotten only 1,600 replacements since the start of operations in January. Mobile Group Popov, the armored spearhead that was supposed to cut off the entire German southern wing, started Operation Gallop with roughly 212 tanks spread across 4 tank corps. To put that in perspective, that's about the strength of a single German Panzer Corps, and Vatin expected this force to cover 270 counter in a single thrust. Soviet tank units during Operation Uranus, when they were at full strength, had only managed 100 to 120 km per lunge, which was roughly how far a T-34 could go cross-country on a single load of fuel. Popov's men were being asked to do more than double that distance with a third of the tanks and supply lines that were already failing. By mid-February, Popov was reporting that his fuel tanks were at half capacity. He couldn't move, and yet STAVKA kept pushing them forward. The planning, as one historian described it, ignored terrain, weather, logistics, and the enemy. It was driven entirely by post-Stalingrad overconfidence. They had done this before too. After the victory in front of Moscow in January 1942, the Soviets had overextended in exactly the same way and been punished for it. They were about to learn that lesson again. Manstein launched his counteroffensive on February 20th, 1943. He called it the backhand blow. The concept was straightforward. Let the Soviets punch deep into territory where they had no supply lines. Wait until they were exhausted and out of fuel. Then hit their exposed flanks with concentrated armor. The execution was anything but straightforward. Manstein organized the attack in 3 stages. First, destroy the overextended Soviet spearheads. Second, recapture Kharkov. Third, strike north toward Kursk in coordination with Army Group Center. That third stage never happened, but the first 2 would prove devastating enough. General Hoth's 4th Panzer Army struck first, driving into the flank of Vatutin's southwestern front. 2 convergent thrusts, the 57th Panzer Corps and the 48th Panzer Corps from the south and the 2nd SS Panzer Corps from the northwest, caught the Soviets from multiple directions simultaneously, and the timing was devastating. At the very moment the German panzers hit, Soviet unit after Soviet unit was running out of fuel. Popov's mobile group, which had been the tip of the Soviet spear, was surrounded and destroyed. The 25th Tank Corps, the same unit that had nearly stumbled onto Hitler at Zaporizhia, was cut off. Its crews ran out of fuel, blew up their own tanks, and tried to make it back to Soviet lines on foot. Their commander, General Pavlov, was wounded and captured. Simultaneously, Hoth's Panzer Corps carved up the Soviet 6th Army over 5 days. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps, which had been pulled back after evacuating Kharkov, returned to the fight on February 3rd, and the 3 SS divisions swept southeast and piled onto the already collapsing Soviet 6th Army. Within a week of the counterattack beginning, Manstein had shattered the Soviet offensive in the south and was driving north. The Soviets had lost nearly all their tanks. Several armies were destroyed or rendered combat ineffective, and the Germans, who everyone had written off 3 weeks earlier, were advancing. By early March, Hoth's 4th Panzer Army, including the SS Panzer Corps, had covered 80 kilometers and was positioned about 16 kilometers south of Kharkov. The Labston data. Division forced a bridgehead over the Miser River and opened the road to the city. Manstein's plan was to bypass Kharkov and encircle it from the north, cutting off the Soviet defenders and destroying them in the open. But Hauser, the same SS general who had disobeyed Hitler's orders to hold the city a month earlier, now disobeyed Manstein's orders to bypass it. On March 11th, Hauser ordered a direct assault. Das Reich attacked from the west, Leibstandata from the north. Totenov screened the northern and northwestern flanks. The assault troops were organized into Camp Gripen battle groups, and each was assigned a specific road to push down into the city. Waiting for them inside was Rylo's 3rd Tank Army, along with the 69th Army. The defenders included the 1st and 2nd Guards Tank Corps and at least 4 rifle divisions, dug into prepared positions across the city. Soviet troops had turned buildings into strong points, placed snipers in upper floors, and set up anti-tank guns to cover the main avenues of approach. On the first day, Das Reich pushed in from the west and reached the main railway station, but that was as far as they got. Hoth ordered Hauser to pull Das Reich out and swing east to encircle the city as originally planned. Hauser refused. Hoth repeated the order after midnight. Hauser refused again. On the 3rd attempt, he finally complied and Das Reich disengaged, using a corridor opened by Leibstandata to cross through northern Kharkov and redeploy to the east side of the city. Meanwhile, Leibstandata was fighting its way through the northern suburbs house by house. On March 12th, the division broke through the Soviet defenses and pushed toward the center. By the end of the day, the 2nd Panzer Grenadier Regiment's 2nd Battalion had reached a position just 2 blocks north of Jinsky Square, taking heavy casualties from Soviet snipers the entire way. By evening, they had surrounded the square. That night, the regiment's 3rd Battalion under the command of Joachim Piper linked up with the 2nd Battalion in the square and attacked south, crossing the Kharkov River and opening the road toward Moscow Avenue. When the Soviet city commandant, Major General Belov, shifted his forces north to deal with Leibstandata's breakthrough, he uncovered the western side of the city. Das Reich, now repositioned, pushed in through the gap. By March 13th, Boff realized the position was lost and ordered a fighting withdrawal to the east. By March 14th, the city had fallen. Manstein's forces pushed on and took Belgorod on March 18th, and then the Rasputita arrived. The spring thaw turned the entire front into mud and nobody was going anywhere. In less than a month, Manstein had driven the Soviet forces in southern Russia all the way back to their starting lines. He had destroyed or crippled approximately 5 Soviet armies. Soviet casualties for the operation came to an estimated 90,000 with around 6,000 dead and 14,000 captured. The SS Panzer Corps, which had done much of the heaviest fighting, took roughly 4,300 killed and wounded. For context, the Soviets had been planning the final destruction of Army Group South. Instead, they were now the ones scrambling to rebuild. When we look at this whole operation, a few things stood out about why Manstein succeeded where most commanders would have failed. First, he traded space for time. While STAVKA saw the German withdrawals as collapse, Manstein was deliberately giving ground to shorten his supply lines while stretching the Soviet ones. Every kilometer the Soviets advanced made them weaker and made him relatively stronger. Second, he concentrated his armor at the decisive point. Instead of spreading his panzer divisions across the entire 700-kilometer front, he pulled them together for a single massive strike against the most overextended Soviet forces. He hit the weakest point with his strongest units. Third, the Luftwaffe. This doesn't get mentioned enough. The 4th Air Fleets increased from 350 to over 1,000. Daily sorties gave the Germans temporary air superiority at the exact moment they needed it. Shuka dive bombers hammered pop-offs in the 6th Army's columns, softening them up before the panzers even made contact. And 4th, the Soviets did most of the damage to themselves. STAVKA launched too many operations simultaneously. Operation Star, Gallop, Polar Star, and the offensive against Army Group Center, all running at the same time, all competing for the same limited reserves. When Manstein's counterattack hit, there was nothing left to plug the gap, because every available unit was already committed somewhere else. Manstein had done everything right, but he also had help from an enemy that was too confident to see what was coming. The front stabilized along the Donets River by late March, roughly where it had been before the Soviet winter offensive began. The mud stopped both sides, but the shape of the new front line created something that would define the rest of 1943, when Manstein's forces retook Belgorod and halted, and the Soviet Central Front's offensive further north also ground to a stop. What was left was a massive bulge in the Soviet lines, centered on the city of Kursk, about 120 kilometer wide at its base, packed with Soviet armies. Manstein saw the opportunity immediately. He proposed attacking the salient as soon as the ground dried, before the Soviets could fortify it, but Hitler delayed. He wanted more tanks, more divisions, more time to prepare. The operation was pushed from April to May, then to June, then to July. It was given a name, Operation Citadel. By the time the Germans finally launched Citadel on July 5, 1943, the Soviets had spent 4 months building the deepest defensive network in military history. They knew exactly where the attacks would come and exactly when. Kursk became the largest tank battle ever fought, and this time the Germans could not pull off another reversal. The Soviet counter-offensives that followed, Operations Kutuzov and Rumyantsev, retook Belgorod and Kharkov for the final time in August 1943. Manstein's counterattack in February and March had stabilized the front and bought Germany months of time, but it also created the very salient that drew the Wehrmacht into its last strategic offensive in the east. The Third Battle of Kharkov was the last time the German army would take a major city from the Soviets. It was the last time a single commander's operational skill could reverse the momentum of an entire front. And it was the last time anyone on the German side could look at the situation and believe, even briefly, that things might still turn around.